Next session is going to be a panel discussion on managing reputational risk and protecting brands. And to introduce our moderator, I'd like to call Peter back on stage, and we'll be starting the session in 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Riza. All right, so I'd like to introduce Gaurav Kapoor, our Chief Operating Officer here at MetricStream. Gaurav is the COO and has been with the company since inception. Until 2010, he served as the CFO, and during this time, he led the company's financial strategy as well as sales, marketing, and partnerships. He also launched ComplianceOnline.com, a MetricStream business unit which has grown to become a leading online GRC community and content provider. Previously, he held strategic positions in a number of Silicon Valley companies, and prior to that, he spent several years in marketing operations and business roles in Citibank Asia and the US. He also serves on the board of Regalix, a digital innovation and marketing company. Please welcome Gaurav to the stage.
Thank you, Peter. So what a fantastic session, Peter, you moderated, and the outcome of the last 3 hours of discussion. One of the things that we've been hearing a lot about is around reputational risk and what really does it mean. And we have the privilege of 3 very strong professionals who have actually done a lot around this space over the last many years. And I have the privilege of introducing the 3. One was already on stage, but I'm going to introduce all 3 again. So the first one is Kenneth Bacon. Ken serves as a co-founder and managing partner of RailField Partners, an investment management firm that invests and operates multifamily properties. Prior to that, most recently, for the last 19 years, he was with Fannie Mae, and most recently, the executive vice president of the multifamily mortgage business. And he was, at the end, running close to a $200 billion business with about in asset size with about a $1.5 billion profits. He also was the director of the Resolution Trust Corporation and held officer positions at Morgan Stanley and Kidder Peabody. Currently, Ken serves on the board of directors of Comcast, of Ally Financial, Welltower, and Dominion. Welcome, Ken. And I didn't want to miss the Ken also, in recognition of his service to the Marshall Scholars Program, he was awarded an Order of the British Empire by the British government. Thank you, Ken, for being on stage. Next, I wanted to introduce John Beeler. John Beeler serves as the EVP, Chief Risk Officer, and the Assurance Officer for Salesforce.com. Check, sorry. Prior to that, and it's very interesting, prior to that, John served as the Chief Compliance Officer, and prior to that, the Head of Audits for Salesforce as well. So all 3 lines of function we have in one person right here. And John also served at Amgen, at Brunswick, and PwC in the past. Thank you, John. And last but not the least, we have Sarah, who we just met a few minutes ago. And Sarah was well introduced, but she serves as, she leads the regulatory relations group at Wells Fargo as part of the Wells Fargo's corporate risk organization. And she oversees an organized and cohesive approach to working with the company's federal regulators and also regulators in other jurisdictions. Prior to Wells, Sarah was with McKinsey as a partner in the risk practice. And prior to that, 25 years with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where she started as an examiner, but rose up to become the EVP and head of the Financial Institution Supervision Practice. Welcome, Sarah, back again.
Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, one of the things that we're seeing continuously is really trying to understand what reputational risk really means. A lot of companies or a lot of professionals view that as an aggregation of risks, that happen in the enterprise, outside the enterprise, and impacts in some way the reputation of the company, and therefore shareholder value, board representation, regulatory view of the organization. So I wanted to first actually just request you to give a couple of, or maybe a minute of your roles and how you see risk in your roles. And Sarah, I know you talked a little bit about that in the last, but from a perspective of risk, how do you view your roles, as Ken, as a board member or as a risk officer, as the regulatory compliance officer?
I'd say reputational risk has to be one of your primary concerns in today's world because, first of all, let's just be honest. 30 or 40 years ago, things could happen in a company and it wouldn't reflect necessarily on you as a person. Today it does. People organize to vote you in or out of boards based in part on the reputation of whatever you did in your day job, but also your board service. So it's personal. It affects shareholder value. It even affects employee recruitment and retention. So reputational risk, I mean, it's never been unimportant, but I'd say it's more important today, particularly given the prevalence of social media and the velocity with which, I say bad news can spread. So if your reputation is bad, it can just affect all dimensions of your business very quickly.
Yeah, from my perspective, I get to work across all three lines of defense within the organization, as well as the board of directors. And it really permeates everything when you think about reputational risk. And it's really driven from outcomes from all kinds of other risks that you have as a company. And so really thinking through how all three of those lines of defense work together for the betterment of the company and to reduce your risk exposure, and then eventually having some kind of catastrophic reputation risk happen. It's really about getting those three lines of defense working together along with your board of directors. And I think you can have some positive outcomes. I really look at this as an opportunity for us all, not just something that is scary and daunting.
And what I would add is, from a regulatory perspective, reputational risk is also your reputation with the regulators, which is, as I have experienced at Wells and as I saw when I was a regulator, can deteriorate so rapidly. It's one or two missteps and your regulators immediately lose confidence. And then today, that's actually known publicly. Back in the olden days when I was at the New York Fed before computers, that wasn't known as well because you didn't get the same kind of speed of information transfer. You didn't get the same kind of social media appearances. And now that actually happens even with your regulators.
Yeah.
So reputational risk, your reputation with your regulators is critical.
The velocity is so intense.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
John, picking up from what you said earlier, you look at the recent headlines all across, whether it's banks that have faced quite a significant amount of scrutiny in the US as well as in Europe. You look at airline companies because of service employee behavior. Look at transportation tech companies where we've seen internal employee behavior impact reputation and millions of consumers actually walking away from those companies at times. The question is that the accountability of reputational risk could be sitting ultimately, obviously, with the C-level execs. But given that some of this is coming from the first line, and John, I'll pose this question to you: how do you bring the coordination between the first, second, third line of defense, to protect risk at the end, reputational risk at the end?
Right. So, I mean, I think it's really about communication and getting together and talking together. Tools are incredible, and I know we'll be talking about those more throughout the discussion here today. But a lot of it is taking all that information that's coming from your tools, from your data analysis, and actually getting in a room and talking through it across all three lines of defense. So the operations folks, which is the first line. The second line tends to be the risk management folks and compliance folks. And then the individuals making up your internal audit organization being the third line. But I think if those teams aren't getting together and talking and doing it in a transparent, thoughtful way, you're not going to get there. Many times when you look at the risks that have happened in companies, whether it be from some external event or being something within their control or third-party risk, et cetera, it was always because somebody knew there was a possibility that this happened, but they weren't talking to somebody else and giving them the information that they needed to do the correct level of mitigation or whatever. And so having those table or those groups come together to the table and talk together and work out systematic action plans to reduce your level of risk, and then to monitor those and make sure that they're appropriately being reduced is critical.
And I'd love to get your perspective as well. You've been on the first line yourself, running a business, and then now on the board of pretty large, both consumer and business companies. Yeah.
You know, I'd say that one thing you have to do, I remember early in my career when people would have codes of conduct and you check the box. It was basically pretty simple. Don't steal. Don't slap your boss. Don't spit on a customer. I mean, things were, you had to engage in really egregious behavior to really worry about it. And risk was even viewed, a lot of times, it was credit risk or operational risk. So did I lose money? Did the systems break? You have to do today, though, you have to get everybody just thinking about risk, all risk all the time, because one of the things that's happened in the world today, you could have a business, you could make money, but people are looking at how you do things and who you do things with. So if consumers perceive that I'm running my business and I'm burning coal, if people perceive that I'm running my business and I discriminate and I use groups to make up that, you know, I don't have any green elves in my business, people will get agitated about that. They might boycott me because of the type of energy I use, or do I favor one group over another? Did my CEO engage in something that was politically upsetting? So if you look today, for example, you see that people have appeared on certain Fox News shows, and then people say, I want to boycott that product. So all of a sudden, it's not just about the bottom line. It's not just about operational risk. You have to be aware that how I do things, who I do things with, and how I communicate that has become increasingly important. So that risk is something that you have to walk, talk, eat, and breathe every day. And even at the board level, you look at Vanguard, you look at BlackRock, you look at ISS, you look at Glass Lewis, ESG issues are becoming increasingly important. So, you know, the days of being able to put risk in a box, you can't do that anymore.
And Sarah, I mean, your role itself partially, you know, it's interesting to see that the group, you know, is in the part of the corporate risk group, and part of your role actually has been to see how the first, second, third line of defense come together. What would be your opinion on how you're trying to do this?
Yeah, a couple of things. We start with everyone is a risk manager, so everyone across the company is a risk manager. We launched new training this year that everyone takes, from your tellers all the way up through the organization and across the organization. So emphasizing that risk management is everyone's job, I think is a real shift. I think the second piece of it is that risk is the first topic on an agenda, so it goes to the communication, it goes to behavior. If you talk about risk first, then it starts to get ingrained in how we do business, how people think about their jobs. I have to think about the risk, and I have to think about how I'm going to meet my sales goals, et cetera. The final thing that we've done is actually for incentive compensation this year, 50% is based on risk management. It is tied directly to risk management outcomes. And so, this will be the first year that everybody who gets incentive compensation at the company has this 50% risk management goal. And that, I think, is really shifting how people are thinking about their day-to-day. I have to think about the risk at the same time that I'm thinking about how I'm actually doing my job.
Yeah, I think that's really important, aligning the incentives and then also aligning the risk priorities around your budget process and your planning cycles and your strategic priorities. Because if you get all those embedded into those at the time of those processes, not afterwards, you have a better chance of success of mitigating the risk along the way as too.
So just shifting gears a little bit, you know, can you briefly talk about the Fox News, somebody coming on, you know, on stage and talking about something? Jim, quickly in the morning, he talked about the known unknowns as an example. One of the interesting research is that research that Forbes did recently, they said that only 16% of organizations or executives are actually keeping reputational risk as one of the risks they'll worry about this year, as an example, only 16%. But when they peel the onion, it also talks about the fact that they seem to be more in control of the internal environment in the sense that risks within the organization. But majority of the reputational risks sometimes come from external to the organization, whether you look at the cyber breaches coming from third parties, environmental hazards, certain geopolitical things that can impact your reputation, they're coming from third party or outside the wall environment. So how do you prepare for external risks that can damage your reputation very quickly? So maybe, Sarah, maybe you can take the lead and then.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is knowing what the environment is and having enough insights, gathering data. Are you spending enough time looking at what social media is saying? That's, at least in my experience in my later years at the Fed, understanding what was out there gave us clues as to where there were potential problems. When you started to see spikes in complaints externally going up, then you knew there might be something going on in that particular organization. So I think as a starting point, actually having the view into the tools to actually understand the landscape and what's actually going on. What are people actually saying? What are the things that they're really worried about?
I'd say that you have to even start with something even more fundamental, and that is, again, companies used to spend a lot of time on mission statements and corporate values, and again, that was an exercise a lot of people went through. Okay, I'll do this once a year and I pay attention to it. Well, again, today, you have to really take that seriously because chances are the external threats, there are two categories. One will be the cyber thing where someone steals my data. Okay, that's one threat. But the other threat that I think is more and more common is about your values, diversity, the environment, your corporate governance, your overseas investments, how do you treat your transgender employees. There'll be a whole host of issues that you really have to think about because you're gonna hit the landmine one day. And you don't wanna hit the landmine one day and have someone say, what is your role on X? And you haven't thought about it. So I think you have to scan the external environment and say, what are the issues that people are concerned about, the population is concerned about, and politicians are concerned about. And I'll use Salesforce as an example. Gun control is a big thing. And, Salesforce has told people, like, we're concerned about this. Now, some people might say, oh, I'm going to criticize them for taking a stand. But I think if you're a company just like credit card companies and banks, people say, I'm concerned about gun control. What is your position? You facilitate the business of these people. What are you doing? And even if you say, I'm not going to do anything, you have to be able to articulate that, because when you monitor social media and you pick up something, you have to be ready to respond in a quick fashion. And so, again, I think we all think about the cyber attacks, but the harder things to think about are, direct things on your values, your mission, and how you interact with the world.
John, since he mentioned Salesforce.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to go there on that particular topic, but it is an area though that companies really have to be ready to defend, their values in relation to stances that they take. I think one thing that's really helpful for companies to think about too, as you look at risks converging and how things could happen simultaneously together, like a cyber attack and maybe a natural disaster event. Think about from a tabletop exercise standpoint. I think it's a really good way for companies to actually think through what could happen in all these different areas that tie into reputational risk and how you would go through that process to be able to react.
By the way, when I mentioned Salesforce, I hope that didn't come across as critical.
Oh, no.
I think I said that because of the fact I think they got out ahead of it and said, here's our stance, as opposed to being reactive. And that, by the way, that's very uncomfortable in a boardroom when you tell people, you know, we need to have a stance on X, because people say that's controversial. I don't know what the stance is. But I'll look at another company, look at Google, when they were going to do some contracts with the Defense Department. I'm sure they were debating at the board level, and all of a sudden their employees seized the momentum and said, we're against this. So again, so that you're sitting in a boardroom with Google, and I'm John Hennessy, and I'm the chair, and all of a sudden someone says, well, John, you can't debate this any longer. It's in the paper. A lot of your employees are against this. What are you going to do?
So the flip side of the coin, typically it's been not easy to measure reputational risk or a direct correlation between reputational risk and performance necessarily. But over the last couple of years, we are starting to see companies making an attempt towards tying more to shareholder value or performance. For example, classically, you could have an ethical violation, you could have a regulatory violation, you could have a performance violation, and that's what has caused reputational risk or reputational issues. But one recent example, BBC actually covered the Levi's IPO, and they said that 30% of the shareholder value that was appropriated by Levi's was because of their ethical practices around, environmental, around employees, around third parties, as an example. So it's interesting to see that they were able to appropriate a certain value to the shareholder performance. So, based on your roles, how are you seeing the performance side of reputation? So how do you link performance to reputation? How do you link shareholder value to reputation more discreetly?
Guess my turn. I think you can attempt to do it, but again, this is my personal view, not necessarily the view of the boards I serve on. I always tell people that there are things that are appropriate for financial measures, but there are other things I think you have to avoid that. So what I always tell people, you know what, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to diversity, I think you do it just because it's the right thing to do. If I try to put a dollar, I've heard people say, diverse companies do better. I'm always a little bit nervous about that, because I always say, well, look, there'll be someone who'll come up with a study next year and say it hurts shareholder value. I think you do certain things just because it's the right thing. And I tell people, it really comes back almost to the 10 Commandments. It's just a basic thing. And I think, by the way, one of the reasons that capitalism was so strong and successful in America for so long was because people viewed business as being kind of reflective and embodying a lot of their values. And I think the attacks on business recently have been because some people say, well, it doesn't reflect my values. So I think while you can tie certain things to shareholder value, I think in the long run, you're better off just to say, you know what, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. We're not going to steal, we're not going to rob. That was old school, but now here are all the positive things we're going to do, and we're going to do them because it's just the right thing to do.
I agree with that 100%. Just set the right values, make sure that you're hiring the right people that will do the right thing, and I think things will take care of themselves. And if you get into a situation where you have really bad tone from the top, it's going to be really very impossible, and I would run from those kinds of companies.
Are there any comments?
Well, I think Wells is a pretty classic case study of reputational risk and the damage that it can lead to, including erosion of shareholder value. And so I'm still living the story as we all are, but constantly understanding both internally how your team members are feeling, externally how your customers and your clients are feeling, and then doing the broader landscape to continue to measure how are we doing on any number of the areas that they care about. And so it is important to actually measure it, because if you're not measuring it, you're not paying attention to it, both internally and externally.
Thank you. And before I open it up to the audience to ask questions, one question that always comes up that the external, internal environments are getting complex, data is floating intensively, velocity, volume of information. how do you use technology to actually both communicate the message of culture that you talked about, Ken, and also to get information back where there might be issues and to react to that fast. Yeah. So what are you seeing in terms of technology in your organizations in terms of being able to handle both the communication as well as the aggregation and response to that? Yeah. Maybe you can start with Sarah.
You've got some of the best, so that's why I'm turning to you.
No, I think it's a continual process. Figuring out the right tools and collecting all the tools that make the most sense to use in this space. It's obviously making sure you understand the data and then connecting the data points across the way. I think also I'm really excited about what predictive analytics and artificial intelligence are going to have in this whole space. We certainly don't have that all figured out yet, but we're starting to use some test cases and starting to figure that out. And that's I think an area of bringing all of those collective data sets together and figuring out from a predictive standpoint. I think it's pretty exciting from a risk angle.
Going back to what I call kind of the hard aspects of the business, one of the good things I think that's happening with technology is the ability to aggregate a lot of risk-related data quickly, do correlations, and even model certain things. Particularly if you're a regulated institution, like a financial institution, for example, I think that speed and the ability to look at data, and not only data in terms of like traditional risk measures, but also what are my customers doing? What feedback am I getting from my customers? At lunch today we talked about the Net Promoter Score. I think there are a lot of things out there that before you had to go through lengthy polling data or it took a long time. Well, now there are a lot of things you can do to get very quick feedback on how you're doing, whether it's operational risk, credit risk, or your consumer relations. And I think that's been one of the good sides of technology. We often talk about the bad side in terms of cyber risk, reputational risk. One of the good things is it really allows me to touch a lot of places quickly. And you mentioned artificial intelligence. I think that's going to be the next step, because the dream is always, if you're a risk manager, is to be able to come in and be ahead of the curve as opposed to reacting, to have predictive analysis at your fingertips.
The only other angle I would add is the communication angle that you asked. And the one thing that I don't think has changed, even with all of the technology that we have, is the fact that you have to, I think it's 6 times, repeat your messages internally and externally. What we're learning, how we're changing, how we want our team to change. It's not just once, and it's not just twice, and it's not just one channel of communication. It's using all channels of communication and doing it multiple times.
Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes, too, when we go back to the 3 lines of defense again, some of the different lines are using different tools, and they have different information at their fingertips. And again, that's where if you communicate effectively across those 3 lines, you'll get those insights that you can gather from all 3 groups coming together.
Well, thank you. I wanted to give a few minutes for questions. I'm sure there are a few questions in the audience, so you can direct it to any one of the people on the panel, or we'll moderate it. Yes. The mic's coming.
Thank you. You made a very good point about the fact that social media, has changed the world. When I was a little girl in college taking classes, we studied reputational risk, and we talked about IBM. IBM at the time were interviewing spouses so that they wouldn't affect the firm's reputation. That stopped. We got into privacy issues and people saying, I have my own career. What do I have to do with my spouse? And coming out to a whole other world. Then we had situations such as the Me Too. It's an individual, one person, but people are boycotting the firm because they hired that person 10 years ago. And another situation is Nike last September. Nike hired a spokesperson who didn't take a knee from the NFL. Their stocks went down tremendously. Granted, they came up, but only because they happened to have made the mistake at a time just before the football season started again and people forgot. But they went down. People were burning their sneakers, they were burning their stuff, putting videos on YouTube. Nike wasn't sure it was going to recover. And that was from one management decision. So my question is, what oversight should corporations have on their individual executives that are out there? Do we monitor executives' social media? We do monitor a lot of the social media we see on employees, but not executives. So should we start doing that, or is that becoming Big Brother is watching? Do we go into looking at marketing and the image that they're doing and now say, okay, you can't do anything without having the risk managers review it? So where does that line cross? When are we doing too much? When are we doing too little? What should we be doing that we're not doing yet?
Not all at once.
Panel moderator, what do you think?
So I'm gonna make you this.
Okay, one part of the question is pretty straightforward, and that is official corporate activities. Clearly, for example, I know in one corporation I know, when they design new commercials, when they design new outreach campaigns, it's not just senior executives take a look at it. Partly they do it because, oh, this is interesting, but part of it is, let's make sure we're all on board for what we're saying. The harder one that you mentioned, the one that made me cringe a little bit, is about a person's Facebook and Twitter statements. Because there have been instances recently where people have said things on Twitter or put things on their Facebook page that have embarrassed their companies and indeed have even led to disciplinary action against people. And usually, by the way, that's because someone picks up on it and then it becomes news. I really haven't heard a hard and fast, I haven't heard it come up yet, and not to say it's not happening, where a company says, we're going to start looking at your social media. I haven't heard that, not to say it's not happening, I haven't heard that. But that being said, I will tell you what I tell my kids. In fact, I have a son who works at Facebook, I have a daughter who's in financial services, and I always tell them, I said, I did a lot of crazy stuff in college. The 70s, sex and drugs and rock and roll. I said, but we took Polaroids, and unless somebody goes and digs in their trunk, what I did is history, it's gone. I said, you put it online, it lives forever. Mm-hmm. So if you're out with your friends and you're drinking and somebody thinks it's cute to take that picture of you drinking, it ain't cute, right? You just don't do it. And in fact, I post very little on social media myself, partly for privacy reasons, but also just because of the fact I'm old-fashioned. I say, I don't know if I want everybody knowing where I went for vacation or who I was hanging out with. A lot of people do, but again, I always tell people that it may seem innocent at the time, but what if you're hanging out with a guy and then a year later, it turns out that person was sexually harassing people at their job, and you're up there with your arm around them on the golf course, right? So I just said, it's added the dimension. I don't like to think about Big Brother, but I will tell you that, again, the newspaper is always full of stories about someone did something, it wasn't on the company's nickel, it wasn't on the company's media, but all of a sudden, a senior executive, a board member did something, and it leads to a bad end.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, companies are doing training in this space too about things to say and not say, and just the fact that these things stick with you, they can damage the company's reputation risk. It's just like speaking to the media when you post something on Twitter. So, there are trainings and guidelines that many companies are putting out just because of this very situation.
Any other questions?
My question is really around reputational risk being a consequential risk. This panel, as well as a panel before lunch, spoke about reputational risk being a breakdown in corporate governance, internal controls, operational risk. So if that's the case, and if the C-suite is held accountable for reputational risk, who is responsible for managing reputational risk? We've got our risk department who provides oversight and challenge, and we want to report on it, but who's managing it, monitoring it, and measuring it?
So maybe John, given all the roles you've played, maybe you can answer the question, and then I know Sarah's kind of covering a number of these things as well.
I actually think you hit on the head earlier, Sarah, when you said that, managing risk, whether it be reputational or otherwise, it's really all of our responsibility in the company. Obviously, they're, overall, the highest levels of the company, there's responsibility for risk management, but all of us across the companies that we work in, if we aren't thinking about how to appropriately manage risk in our daily lives and daily execution, all the way from the lowest level employees up to the members of the board and senior executives, I think we're missing something. And then we can have all kinds of other great programs to collectively work together to reduce risk profiles and things like that for the risks that we know that are out there. But we all have to take that responsibility in our daily execution.
I think that's right. Everyone is a risk manager, and it has to be managed. Reputational risk in particular is something that everybody in the organization can be part of. You can either make it better or you can make it worse. Credit risk, I don't have any say on credit risk, but reputational risk, I can myself actually introduce reputational risk into the company.
We have time for probably one more question.
I had actually a couple, but I'll just put them out there. First, Sarah was talking about risk management. It's everyone's job and the training everyone. Does that include the janitor, the secretary? I'm gonna use the old term here, secretarial pool, everybody that might be touching your product, even vendors. And then the second one is related to the young lady's question there about renegade employees. Rogue employees go bad, like, the Marine. If you're in the Army, you can rob the 7-Eleven store, and they'll just say a guy robbed the 7-Eleven store. If you're a Marine, then they say a Marine robbed the 7-Eleven store. So you have people that work for you that might besmirch your reputation, even though it's in their personal lives. So how do you actively control for this? And I got a few ideas, but I want to hear yours.
Ken, do you want to? I know that.
Well, first of all, I think the things you mentioned as far as training, code of conduct issues, I think that's everybody. And on all my boards, but one board in particular, I can go down this department, only 89% of the people completed their training. Why is that? In other words, you measure the training, you measure, just like you measure any operational incident, you can measure the effectiveness of your training. And another good thing about technology now, not only can you give people training, you can come back and poll people to see how well they're applying it. You can ask them what they think about their manager, you can ask customers, you can ask vendors. So I think that's covered. A harder one is, again, the issue about what people do in their private lives. I'd say it's kind of easy if it's a C-suite person. I mean, it's just understood that, hey, if you do something that's embarrassing, it's not like the old days. We can't bury that. And there are things that politicians can get away with that CEOs could never get away with, right? And that's something new. And by the way, I'm not picking on one party, because if you're Republican, you'll say, well, look at Clinton. If you're Democrat, you'll say, look at the current president. I mean, we can all think of examples in political life where people have done things and the result is people leave office or they get investigated. But as a CEO, if you think about it, in today's world, if it's the CEO or the CFO, one egregious incident, and that's usually it. And if the board doesn't act, then the investors will get that board. So I'd say that it's become a rather unforgiving world. And by the way, that kind of bothers me sometimes, It bothers me because we all do knuckleheaded things. You know, I wish I was perfect. I wish I was a person without sin. But, you know, people do stupid stuff sometimes. But when it gets out, if you're a C-suite person, world isn't forgiving. What's harder is it's a middle manager, it's a lower level employee, particularly when it's things that you can't easily verify. So someone says something about their marriage or their personal life, how do you know it's true, but it's out in social media? So it becomes hard.
So thank you. You know, in summary, it looks like it is everybody's job. The right culture and the right communication of culture is extremely important, and not just within the walls of the enterprise, but also, you know, all the connected enterprise, if you will. The right policies have to be put in place, but again, it's equally important that the culture is communicated effectively. So thank you for all the insights, and appreciate your being on the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.